Welcome to you all. My name is Ronald Klaus, and just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm on my third career. I used to be an engineer, then I became a pastoral leader, and now my wife and I work as spiritual and economic developers in a country overseas. You might say that I went from being interested in things and how they work to people, and now to cultures and how they work. I've titled this series, Things That Shape Us Without Our Permission, and it's based on two premises. Much of who we are as people has been shaped by uninvited forces. And secondly, many of the things that shape us are embedded in our unconscious minds. So how are we shaped? Well, obviously it starts with our parents and families. None of us choose our parents, they choose such things as our first language. My parents and grandparents immigrated from European, German-speaking communities. My parents fully assimilated here, but they wanted me to retain some of their German culture. So in my early years, we spoke only German at home. And then they pushed me out the door to learn English on the street from my friends. Of course, they shaped us in a lot of other ways besides language. After our parents comes our culture. Once we get a little older, we begin to relate to people outside our families and are shaped by their culture. Culture has been called a way of life for an entire society. It includes our beliefs and institutions that are passed down from generation to generation. As such, it includes our manners, dress, language, religious beliefs, rituals, art forms, behavior, laws, morality, and systems of belief. My point is, we pick up many of these things from our culture without realizing it. Now a disclaimer. We're going to talk specifically about Western culture. Firstly, we don't have time to deal with all the world's culture. Second, I'm not an expert in others, but I hope I can provide some guidance about this one. And finally, whether we like it or not, we're part of this one. It's the one we're swimming in, so we need to learn how to deal with it. Also, by dealing with one culture, I hope we can get some idea of how they all work. Even though they're different in their content, they all work on us the same way. So here's a starting observation about all cultures. They have a history embedded in them. The West didn't get to where it is now in just the last few years. It has been shaped and changed over thousands of years. Furthermore, as we moved into a new era, we took some of the previous ones with us. We're now living in a very polarized culture, and we didn't get here overnight, or even because of one president. We got here step by step. If we don't understand the steps, we don't understand where we are now. And if we don't understand how we got here, we'll never be able to do anything about it either, personally, or how we can fit into the present world. So how do the various uninvited forces shape us? I've already said many of these forces are unconscious and therefore we're not very aware of them. And we can get a little idea of how this works from some of the developments in computer programming. A significant advance was the development of the idea of the subroutine. A subroutine is a block of code that is self-contained and accepts input either from another subroutine or from the person running the program. It then produces output, and the cycle continues until some pre-planned ending. Once written, the programmer doesn't have to think anymore about the code within the subroutine. It works, in a sense, all by itself without the need for any further help from the programmer or user. We as people are a gigantic collection of subroutines that have specific physical functions and are constantly exchanging information. Our bodies have thousands of them running all the time. Our brains, for example, have subroutines that keep our hearts and lungs running all the time, even when we're sleeping, without a great deal of attention from us. We can sometimes influence them. We can breathe deeply or pant or hold our breath, but we mostly let our brain subroutines run by themselves. Most of this goes on in our bodies in an unconscious way, and by physical subroutines that were originally written there by our genes. We can even write subroutines in our brains that they can use later. When I first learned to drive, I had to pay great attention to where my feet were, where my hands were, looking at the road. I didn't want anybody to talk to me. But now, in a recent 3-hour drive, I could have a deep conversation with my wife about what we were working on overseas. We talked intently, even while our drive subroutine did most of the routine work of driving. And this is how habits form. When we do something enough, our brains write a kind of subroutine that allows us to do the habit more or less without thinking. That doesn't sound too bad, but let's go even further into how this works. Quite early, we acquire what has come to be called a worldview. The process starts with beliefs that are based on our early experiences. We might come to believe that in general people are decent and reasonably trustworthy. Or we may believe that everyone is out for themselves and we need to be aware of them. These beliefs, in turn, lead to a worldview. This consists of the assumptions we make as we look at the world. For example, suppose you have a persistent stomach pain. You'll probably reach for some over-the-counter medicine and see if that works. If that doesn't work, you'll probably try to consult a doctor. But in the country where we work, some people take a very different path. They'll conclude that someone has put a curse on them. And then they'll find the best witch doctor they can find to try to determine who it was that put the curse on us, and then to take us through the ceremony to remove the pain, and then, for good measure, to put a curse on the person who cursed us. Now, we in the West here are likely to say, oh, that person is just primitive. With enough education, they would change. What that means is that we think our worldview is superior, but it's not that simple. So let me put the shoe on the other foot. Many science-oriented people have a worldview that doesn't accommodate certain events. I recently read some reflections by a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. He writes, in 2008, he received 1,700 phone or email requests for an exorcism, that is, to dismiss a demon from the person. By far the most he's ever gotten in 1 year. And other priests repeated similar upsurge. As organized religion declines in the West, many people are turning to seances and other attempts to have supernatural experiences. In our work overseas, we often encounter credible examples of demonizations and have seen exorcisms. Now, whatever you want to say about them, they seem to work. My point in saying this is that judgment of what is the best worldview is highly subjective. We have one that we didn't ask for. Education may have changed ours somewhat, but in many cases, something from a former one still remains. Our worldview then determines our values. These are the things we think are most important. For example, we may believe that it's important to be completely honest, or we may believe that once in a while a white lie isn't the worst thing in the world. We may believe that we ought to work hard at our studies or careers, or we may believe that making the right connections is more important than hard work. These values then express themselves in our habits and actions. So, what's the genius behind the worldview subroutine that these wonderful brains of ours have created? Life moves quickly enough so that we don't have the time or energy to analyze every situation that comes our way from the beginning. So our worldview is a kind of subroutine that clicks in. We can feed it a problem and expect an answer without a lot of thought about it. But there's a downside. Since a lot of our worldview was shaped by people and culture that we didn't invite, we can't be sure that this subroutine was written well. It can both avoid trouble, but it can get us into trouble, or some of both. One of the big problems we faced, both here and overseas, is that some people have their worldview subroutines written wrong, usually through no fault of their own. Overseas, it often means that people remain poor. Here in the West, in extreme cases, they sometimes become addicts or people with personality disorders. For more ordinary people, it can lead to always thinking, how is it that we keep defeating ourselves? Or it can just produce unhappy people. What this all means is that truly knowing ourselves is a bit more difficult than we think. But the good news is that we can change our worldviews if we choose to do so. But it's hard work and takes an awareness of all the many unasked for things that have shaped us. In our next sessions, we're going to go back in history and look at how the development of our culture has shaped us, even through things that happened thousands of years ago, things that are still embedded in our unconscious minds right now. They've affected our worldviews. Once we see them, we can either applaud them or change them. But for today, my question to help you start your discussion is this: how would you describe your present worldview, and how did you acquire it? Have fun talking about that. Good to be with you. I hope you'll be around for our next time.